The courtroom buzzed with restless energy, a palpable tension rippling through the air. Whispers spread like wildfire among the packed benches, each murmured word stoking the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Shoulder to shoulder, people craned their necks, eager for a glimpse of the man who had become the center of a national scandal. And then he entered. Daniel Steele strode into the room with the self-assured swagger of a man convinced of his invincibility. His sharp charcoal gray designer suit fit like a second skin, exuding wealth and power. His perfectly slicked-back hair caught the harsh fluorescent light, gleaming like a crown. He surveyed the courtroom with a smirk that turned his entrance into a performance, as though the crowd had gathered to applaud him, not to witness his judgment. Steele, the man whose name had dominated headlines for months, looked more like a celebrity gracing a red carpet than a defendant accused of financial crimes that destroyed countless lives. His confidence bordered on arrogance, a brazen display that silenced the courtroom far more effectively than the gavel ever could. But the room grew even quieter when Judge Naomi Carter entered. Clad in her black robe, Judge Carter moved with quiet, unshakable authority. She didn't need to raise her voice or glare to command respect. Her presence alone was enough. Known for her fierce commitment to justice and an unflinching ability to see through lies, Judge Carter was a beacon of fairness in the legal system. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Naomi Carter," the bailiff announced. The crowd stood in unison, a wave of deference sweeping through the room. Everyone except Daniel Steele. While others stood with respect, Steele remained seated, casually flipping through a legal pad as though the trial was nothing more than an annoying formality. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Steele dismissed him with a lazy flick of his hand, his smirk widening. Judge Carter reached her bench, her piercing gaze scanning the room like a spotlight. She didn't say a word about Steele's disrespect, but the weight of her silence was heavy. It was clear to everyone in the room. She had taken note of his arrogance. "You may be seated," Judge Carter said firmly. The trial began, and the layers of Daniel Steele's empire of deceit unraveled. Steele Enterprises was once hailed as a symbol of innovation and financial genius, a corporation that promised to revolutionize investment opportunities for small families and businesses. The reality, however, was far darker. Beneath the polished veneer lay a sprawling web of fraud, lies, and exploitation. Steele had convinced hard-working families to entrust him with their life savings, luring them with promises of secure futures. But those futures never materialized. The fallout was catastrophic. Families lost everything: homes, savings, even their sense of stability. Parents who had meticulously saved for their children's education were left scrambling to make ends meet. Elderly couples, who had envisioned peaceful retirements, now faced the harsh reality of starting over. For Daniel Steele, it was just business. Even as investigators began peeling back the layers of his deceit, Steele exuded an infuriating confidence. "I have the best lawyers money can buy," he told reporters outside his sprawling Malibu mansion, brushing off the allegations. "This will all blow over. It always does." Steele's legal team played their part, delaying the trial with endless motions and attempting to paint him as a misunderstood visionary. But no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the mountain of evidence. Falsified documents, offshore accounts, and damning whistleblower testimonies painted a chilling picture of greed and manipulation. By the time the trial commenced in Charleston, the courtroom became a daily spectacle. Among the audience were the victims of Steele's fraud, ordinary people whose lives he had shattered. Angela Ruiz, a widowed mother of 3, sat in the front row, her face a mask of quiet determination. After entrusting Steele with her savings, she had lost her home and was forced to live in her car with her children. Beside her sat Henry Walker, a retired firefighter who had spent decades risking his life for others. His dreams of a comfortable retirement had been reduced to living in his brother's spare room after his entire life savings vanished. The testimonies that followed were heart-wrenching. Angela Ruiz's voice quivered as she recounted the day she realized she couldn't pay her mortgage. "I begged them not to take the house," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But they didn't care. My kids, we slept in the car for 2 weeks. Do you know what that feels like?" Henry Walker's testimony was equally devastating. I spent 30 years running into burning buildings, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. And this man burned my future to the ground without a second thought. And yet, Daniel Steele remained indifferent. As victim after victim laid bare their suffering, Steele sat back in his chair, scrolling through his phone and occasionally smirking. To him, their pain was mere background noise, irrelevant to a trial he believed he would ultimately win. The prosecution built a damning case, and Steele's arrogance became part of the narrative. Headlines blared with his lack of remorse and blatant disrespect for the court. During cross-examination, prosecutors presented incriminating emails in which Steele instructed his team to falsify records. Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line, one email read. The courtroom gasped as the email was read aloud. When asked about the correspondence, Steele leaned into the microphone, his tone dripping with condescension. Yes, I recognize it. But let's not pretend it means what you're implying. It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand. Judge Carter's gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack. Order in the court, she commanded, her voice cutting through the murmur. She turned her gaze to Steele, her tone icy. Mr. Steele, I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom. But Steele remained unfazed, his smirk intact. What he didn't realize was that Judge Carter wasn't just presiding over a trial. She was dismantling his arrogance, one piece at a time. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom thrummed with an electric energy. Every seat was filled, and the air was thick with anticipation. The stakes were monumental, not just for Daniel Steele, but for every victim whose life he had shattered. Steele sat at the defense table, exuding the same smug confidence that had infuriated so many throughout the trial. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his grin unwavering. It was as if he believed that his wealth and charm could once again shield him from accountability. Judge Naomi Carter, however, had other plans. The courtroom fell silent as she entered, her presence commanding as ever. She took her seat, adjusted her robe, and allowed the silence to settle like a heavy blanket over the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate, and filled with a quiet power. Mr. Steele, she began, her eyes locking onto him, you have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Steele's grin faltered for the first time. The evidence presented in this trial has been overwhelming, Judge Carter continued, her tone unyielding. Your actions were not merely unethical. They were calculated, deliberate, and devastating. You preyed on the hopes and dreams of hard-working individuals, exploiting their trust for your own personal gain. Families lost their homes. Parents were forced to make unimaginable sacrifices. Retirees faced the twilight of their lives in poverty. And through it all, you showed no remorse, no humanity, and no understanding of the pain you caused. Steele shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly cracking under the weight of her words. And yet, Judge Carter said, leaning slightly forward, you have carried yourself in this courtroom with an arrogance that is both staggering and disgraceful. Your blatant disrespect for this court, for your victims, and for the principles of justice has been evident from the very beginning. This is not a boardroom, Mr. Steele. This is a court of law. And here, wealth and privilege do not grant immunity. The courtroom was so silent that the faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. Angela Ruiz sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of vindication. Beside her, Henry Walker stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes glistening with emotion. Judge Carter straightened, her voice resolute. Justice demands accountability. And today, Mr. Steele, you will face the consequences of your actions. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as everyone awaited her next words. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, she declared, her voice ringing with finality. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a stunned silence. Daniel Steele's face drained of color, his trademarked smirk vanishing entirely. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching loudly against the floor. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice filled with fury and disbelief. "I'm Daniel Steele. You don't get to treat me like this." Judge Carter's expression remained calm, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Steele, sit down." But Steele was beyond reason. "This is a joke," he bellowed. "I'll appeal. I'll ruin your career. Do you hear me? You're nothing. Nothing." The bailiffs moved in swiftly, their hands on Steele's arms as he continued to rant and struggle. "You'll regret this," he shouted as they dragged him toward the exit. "Do you hear me? This isn't over." The courtroom remained silent until the doors slammed shut behind him, and then, slowly, a wave of applause began to spread. It started with a single clap, then another, until the entire room was filled with the sound of people standing and cheering. A rare but fitting response to a moment of true justice. Judge Carter allowed the applause for a moment before raising her hand to quiet the room. "Order," she said firmly. "This is still a court of law." The room fell silent once more, but the energy of the crowd had shifted. For the first time, there was a sense of hope. Outside the courthouse, Angela Ruiz stood on the steps, her voice trembling as she spoke to reporters. "We're still rebuilding," she said, clutching her children's hands tightly. "But today, we have hope. Today, we believe in justice again." Henry Walker stood beside her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about the sentence," he said. "It's about the message. People like Daniel Steele aren't untouchable. No one is above the law." For Judge Naomi Carter, the verdict was not a moment of triumph. As she sat in her chambers later that evening, she reflected on the weight of her role. Justice, she knew, was not about celebration. It was about fairness, about giving a voice to the voiceless and holding the powerful accountable. But the impact of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom. Across the country, Steele's downfall sparked conversations about greed, privilege, and accountability. His story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall when their foundation is built on lies. For Angela Ruiz and her children, life slowly began to stabilize. They found a small apartment, and Angela started working 2 jobs to rebuild their lives. One evening, her daughter Sophia handed her a piece of paper, a letter addressed to Judge Carter. "Thank you for standing up for my family," it read. "You didn't just give us justice. You gave us a second chance." The letter made its way to Judge Carter's desk, where it became a reminder of why she had dedicated her life to the law. Justice, she realized, was not just about the punishment. It was about the hope it could restore in those who needed it most. And so, as the country moved forward, the echoes of the trial lingered, a powerful testament to the idea that, in the end, justice prevails.